Now into its second month, the war in Ukraine has failed to give Russia the quick victory it wanted, and there are signs of growing discontent among the political and security elite back in Moscow. A small band of investigative journalists has managed to pierce the veil of secrecy around those officials. Among them, Andrei Soldatov, founder and editor of the Agentura website, which tracks Russia's intelligence services. He's my guest this week from London. How worried are Russia's spies about the progress of the war?
People inside are not really happy with the way the war is going, and they blame just one guy, Vladimir Putin, for that.
So who is most likely to turn against Putin and why? How long can he blame others for the setbacks to the invasion he ordered? Is anyone waiting in the wings to take over if he stumbles? And what are the chances of that? Can Putin in the long term survive this, do you think?
I don't think so.
All that and more on Conflict Zone. Andrei Soldatov, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you for having me.
For a long time, you and some of your colleagues have maintained extraordinary contact with whistleblowers in the Russian security services. You implied recently that failures by Russia's army are causing cracks in Russia's leadership. How serious, in your view, are those cracks?
Well, that is correct. Vladimir Putin started this war by attacking his own people, and we see him attacking his foreign intelligence agency. Then he placed under house arrest two FSB generals, domestic agency, but with a foreign intelligence branch in charge of the situation in Ukraine. Then it was a turn for the National Guard, and the deputy head of the National Guard was forced to retire, and he was just 45 years old. So yeah, it doesn't look really good, and it sounds really, really different from the previous wars Vladimir Putin had. And that caused a lot of confusion inside of the security services, and people inside are not really happy with the way the war is going. And they blame just one guy, Vladimir Putin, for that.
Doesn't he risk turning some of them into powerful enemies against him? After all, it's a pretty ruthless system, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But the thing is that while Russian security agencies and the army, they do not have a tradition to conspire, to be honest. The last time the Russian military tried to have some sort of coup d'etat was probably in the 19th century with the revolt of Decembrists in 1825, and it didn't go well for them. The Russian security services always controlled the army, but it was always this branch of the military counterintelligence, one of the biggest departments of the FSB, and they had their own people everywhere, in every military department, in every military unit. So for the military, it's not actually an option. It's also not an option for the security services, because Vladimir Putin, just for his own security, has two security agencies, and they just there to protect him personally.
If you were Putin, though, whose loyalty do you think you could now count on unconditionally?
I think his two personal security services. He has the service of the protection of the president. These people are the closest to him. And also he has this, the Federal Protection Service. Again, these people are tasked with providing protection for him and for higher level officials. And usually these people are very loyal to him.
Won't there be insiders in this system, people in top positions who are looking at the poor performance of the army, looking at this huge economic backlash from the West that's about to hit them and saying, we can't survive this, it's all gone too far? You talk to some of Russia's spies. How worried are they about the progress of the war and the reaction to it in the West? Something they don't seem to have factored in.
Well, yes, they are worried, but not because of the reaction of the West or the war in Ukraine. They're mostly worried about their positions. They see that Putin has been attacking their own people for quite some time. And to be honest, it started before the war. We've been living in this climate of selective repressions for probably 7 years now. And that is why we have governors and ministers in jail. And also we have FSB people in jail. So people inside, they are mostly worried about their careers. But of course, we understand now that probably the war is not going really well. And mostly they're thinking about themselves. We don't only have a tradition of really good conspiracies, but also it's a problem of the lack of political opposition. Well, it's very different from what we had like 20 years ago. 20 years ago in Russia, we still had some political parties, political groups. And if you have, say, several generals who were unhappy with the president, at least they had some political force to go and to ask them for political support. We do not have this thing now. The political opposition is either in jail or in exile.
Last week, one of your fellow journalists, Vladimir Osechkin, who's published a number of letters from an apparent whistleblower in the FSB, he went so far as to say that with every week the war goes on, the risk of a coup against Putin is growing. You wouldn't agree with that, would you?
Well, first of all, Vladimir Osechkin, he's not my colleague. He's not a journalist. He is a human rights activist. And he's a very good human rights activist. He has his own sources. But my contacts inside of the security services, they are not, I don't hear from them that they are ready for some sort of action. I don't think they are there yet.
When you say ready in what way? Psychologically ready, or ready in terms of organizational movements? What is that readiness?
It's really difficult for them psychologically and organizationally. Psychologically, because now we have in the Russian security services people who grew up and made their careers under one president and probably under one director of the FSB, because the guy who is now in charge, he has been around since 2007. That means that you have a generation of officers who had no experience with other people, with other leaders, with political struggles. They grew up thinking that this president would be forever. And that, I would say, narrowed their thinking and their horizon. When you talk to them, they usually talk about the department, maybe about the unit, but never about the service and never about the country. They do not have these big ideas about the future. They're mostly concerned about themselves. So psychologically, it would be really difficult for them. Organizationally, as I said, just to build an underground organization inside would be a really huge challenge, because we have this big problem of mistrust inside of the security services. So you have middle-level officers distrusting the generals, and generals distrusting the subordinates.
How worried are these people inside the security services about losing their privileges and their money and their perks? Because Putin has helped to create a giant kleptocracy in Russia, hasn't he? Institutionalized corruption in the police and security services has been endemic for years, hasn't it?
Yes, that is true. But starting in 2016, we've been living in a slightly different reality. Putin stripped the FSB and other security services of the right to travel abroad. So they already lost some of their privileges. They do not have, at least officially, a right to have properties abroad. So they were under some sort of, not repression, but some sort of pressure from the president for quite some time. So they know now. But
still he has to buy their loyalty, doesn't he? With something.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, they enjoy good salaries and all that. But it means that they are not feeling themselves independent. They are the instrument. That was made very clear by Putin. So you can see them in every criminal case against the political opposition or the Russian elites, but they are not acting independently.
Whatever happens with Putin, there's no sign of any liberal faction waiting in the wings to take over, is there? None whatsoever.
No, absolutely. It doesn't exist. And to be honest, even the hope that, say, the Russian oligarchs now might be, rebel just because they were put under the sanctions, well, it's not a really option here. These people, because they lost their contracts with the West some years ago, and they were given help by the government by military contracts. Now, many of them became part of the Russian military industrial complex, and that makes them even more dependent on the Kremlin and Putin.
Looking at the repression that's been going on now for some time, and obviously has been stepped up during the war, we have, 15,000 people so far arrested on the streets, beatings, widespread intimidation, long prison sentences. Are you hearing any qualms at all from the intelligence services that this is going too far, that Soviet-style repression is perhaps no longer sustainable in 2022?
No, unfortunately, I don't hear that. On the contrary, people inside the security services are quite convinced that they are, well, the last bastion against the chaos. They have this big idea that all the bad things in Russia happened because of the revolutions. And they have this big fear that something like 1917 might one day repeat itself in Russia, and they have this obsession with the revolution. The problem with the revolution is that, in their opinion, the revolution was started by a small bunch of immigrants, not by a big political party. That is why they're convinced that they need to suppress all kinds of political activities, no matter how big it is. Because
so they're fully behind the crackdown, the new crackdown on Alexei Navalny, the opposition politician, for instance, and the extra 9 years that he's been given in jail. Are there likely to be more show trials like his on the way?
Well, I expect more show trials, but not against the political opposition, because it's already non-existent in the country. But you can expect some big criminal investigations against the Russian elites, because Putin these days is mostly concerned with the loyalty of the Russian bureaucracy. And so you can expect some more governors or more ministers sent to jail. And that is why the security services are so concerned, because when they see that they are now under attack.
Let's talk for a moment about Putin's rhetoric. He's spoken of traitors and scum in society and the need for self-purification. Is he trying to divert blame from himself and onto those who haven't supported his war?
Well, he tries to rely on this feeling shared by many in the country that Russia is a besieged fortress and has been always under some sort of attack from the West. And the biggest help for the West in this case are provided by liberals in the country. So actually what is Putin's doing right now is encouraging people to leave the country. Remember his famous line that the Russian people will split these traitors out of a mouth just like a flea, I think. That was his expression. So actually he's encouraging people to leave. And we see that already more than 70,000 IT specialists left the country, not to mention intelligentsia, journalists and activists.
This pushing out of people who don't support the war, how does that messaging go down with the public at large? The majority are still backing the war, aren't they?
Unfortunately, yes. And they think that actually it's maybe good for the country, some sort of cleansing of the country, because these liberals, they enjoy the good way of life and all of that. And now it's time to protect our country. So we have this deep feeling of a besieged fortress, and Putin knows how to play with it.
What about when the public finds out the scale of the casualties, which haven't yet been revealed to them, just as they found out when the Soviets were in Afghanistan? Soldiers' mothers have shown themselves in the past to be a pretty formidable voice in Russian society, haven't they?
First of all, this kind of activities of the organization you mentioned, as mother soldiers, is suppressed by the authorities. So it's not actually safe for the mothers to call this organization and to ask for help. The other problem is that Putin actually he understood something about the war in Chechnya that, for instance, it's better not to have soldiers drafted in big cities sent to the war. That is why you see all these people now taken prisoners in Ukraine, and they are mostly from Siberia, from distant regions in central Russia, like Mordovia, and
you're saying people won't care about them?
Well, if you have some people killed and you have their relatives in a small town in Mordovia, so of course, well, that would be a problem only for this small community, not for cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg.
But they were sensitive enough about the casualties that when Komsomolskaya Pravda, the newspaper, printed some figures briefly on March the 22nd and then erased them, figures which suggested the army had lost nearly 10,000 men with more than 16,000 injured. They were very worried about that, weren't they? So they're doing their best to cover up the casualties, aren't they?
The latest figures provided last week was 1,351 people killed. But again, of course, it's very far from reality. Yes, you're absolutely right. We got really nervous. But to my surprise, it didn't trigger any reaction in the Russian society. So you have these mothers, you have their relatives, they're quite worried, but that's all about it. And to be honest, the most astonishing part of that is these relatives and mothers, they are mostly worried about their sons, but they are not worried about what their sons doing in Ukraine. So there is this astonishing lack of sympathy for the Ukrainians, which to me is very shocking because every single family, well, not single, okay, every second family in Russia has some relatives in Ukraine.
What went wrong with the progress of the war, with the organization of the war? Last week, Igor Girkin, former colonel in the FSB counterintelligence, said the war in Ukraine was based on a catastrophically incorrect assessment of Ukraine's forces. The enemy was underestimated in every aspect. If that's true, why was the intelligence so poor?
Well, because it was not only about bad intelligence, it was also about the consumer of this intelligence. Everybody knows, including people inside of the FSB, that Putin always has had strong opinions about Ukraine and about the functionality or dysfunctionality of the Ukrainian state. And we know that he's writing articles, he has his strong opinions.
So you're saying he wasn't going to listen to any contrary intelligence? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, and it's not about that the Russian intelligence tried to tell him that, look, you would be greeted with flowers. It's about a very cynical approach and assumption that the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian people would just give up. The state would collapse immediately, and we just need to impose our will, and that's it.
What happened to the huge investments Russia is supposed to have made in its armed forces in recent years? We now hear from Western intelligence their claims that the huge numbers of Russian missiles simply don't work, don't fly straight, don't explode on impact. What happened? Was the money all siphoned off in corrupt deals by people connected to the military?
Well, I think that, yes, the performance of the Russian army is not really impressive, but I would blame not only the army, but also political leadership. This war was very different from all the previous Putin's wars in many respects, including the way it's actually led. I mean, the chain of command, even now, is still unclear. In all the previous Putin's wars, you have this thing, it's called the joint group of forces. And usually you have a commander and you know his name. His name was public. I mean, you always knew the name of a general who was ultimately in charge of a situation on the battlefield.
Well, we've seen 7 generals killed on the battlefield, haven't we? That's pretty unusual, isn't it, to have generals actually there?
Absolutely. And I think the problem is that we do not have this chain of command right now. So we do not know who's in charge. And that is why you have all these problems with communications, with coordination, and that is why the generals, they think that we need to go to the front line to see by themselves and they get killed. So it's not really good in terms of how the whole thing is organized. But political element, I think, still plays a huge role in that. For instance, we do not understand, militarily speaking, why we have the National Guard troops sent into Ukraine. These people are trained to deal with protesters on the streets, not to be engaged in tank battles. And now, well, and actually for a month, we see columns of these people sent into Ukraine, get ambushed, killed and burned, and nevertheless, the Russian government is still doing this.
Mr. Soldatov, what should we read into the strange appearance of the Defense Minister Sergey Shoigu after a long absence from public view? He was slurring in his words in a way we haven't heard before, and the rumours reported by the Ukrainians have been that he's had heart problems. Is he damaged goods now in Putin's eyes?
Well, I heard from my sources that Putin was quite unhappy with Sergey Shoigu. But what we need to remember that Sergey Shoigu is extremely smart and he's a very shrewd political operator. He's been around for 30 years, much longer than Putin himself, and he knows how to play with Putin. So he could have some problems with his heart, but also he could play for a time. The problem Putin is facing now is that there is no real replacement for Sergey Shoigu. We used to have a collection of popular generals who became popular because of the Second Chechen War and the war in Georgia and Syria. What Shoigu did, he got rid of them, most of them. So if you need to find a good replacement for Shoigu right now, it would be a huge challenge. And maybe Shoigu just wanted to make sure that Putin understands that.
Reports in the last few days have said Russia is going to concentrate its military efforts on the Donbass region. One should say there's so far no sign its other operations are ending. But is this Moscow trying to recalibrate its war aims to something it can achieve after having failed to achieve its initial aims? Andrei Kortunov, who heads the Russian International Affairs Council, says the country's leadership can't lose. No matter what, they will need to end this whole story with some kind of victory. What if they can't?
Well, yes, it looks like they're trying to provide some explanations to the public. And we saw that last week with the Russian military going public and talking to some pro-Kremlin media, trying to explain what went wrong, or maybe trying to say that everything is still according to plan. And now they say, yes, it was all about Donbass, not about Kiev, and we are not gonna storm all these cities. It's all about encircling these cities and then about some cleansing. So they're changing rhetoric, obviously. But
this suggests panic and disorganization, doesn't it? Confusion.
Well, not a panic, but confusion. That's for clear. But to be honest, I do not quite understand how Putin can get out of this without claiming some sort of victory. He needs that. He needs to provide some victory to the Russians and to the world, because it's all about his standing. And but to be honest, I don't quite see what it might be. Because even if, say, he has some sort of agreement with Zelensky, the sanctions are still there, the economy is ruined, and for what? I don't quite get it.
And people are talking about a Korean-style partition. Is that a possibility, that he might accept that?
Yes, but again, it would not be a real win for Russia, because he raised the stakes. He said that we need to cleanse Ukraine of the Nazis and all that. We need a new deal with NATO. He's not getting that. So again, I don't quite understand what's his end game here.
President Biden's words in Warsaw at the weekend, supposedly off the cuff, to the effect that Putin can't remain in power. How do you think that will have been understood by the various factions inside the system back in Russia, those who may be thinking that also Putin's time should be coming to an end?
Well, there is one striking difference from what we see now from what we saw in 2014, when we saw the annexation of Crimea. Back then, the Russian bureaucracy, the Russian army, and the Russian securities were all on the same page. they all supported Putin. They believed that it was the right thing to do. Everybody got excited. And unfortunately, a large part of population also believed that it was the right thing to do. Now there is a big shift. So people might still believe that something should be done with Ukraine, but they think that the way it was done was not a very good one, and they blame one guy, Vladimir Putin. And I think it's quite significant.
Very briefly, because we're running out of time, can Putin in the long term survive this, do you think?
I don't think so.
Andrei Soldatov, good to have you on the program. Thanks very much.
Thank you.